Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
This is the third and final episode in a quick 3-part series we've been releasing on what we call the HAT model. The HAT model is an acronym. It stands for healing, achievement, or transcendence. And in personal growth work, usually when we're doing work on ourselves or in our lives, we're in one of these areas, typically. We might have some touch points in the other two, but usually we're primarily in one of these zones. We're either healing and doing growth work through healing, we're doing growth work through achievement, or we're doing growth work through transcendence. We've already talked about in episode 1 healing, and last week we talked about achievement. In this third part, I want to tackle that T, transcendence. What does it mean to transcend in personal growth terms? Like, what do we even mean by that? So let's talk about that. Let's unpack. What do we mean by transcendence, Antonia?
Okay, so this one's tricky. The reason why transcendence is so difficult is because it puts us in a completely different frame than healing and achievement do. Healing and achievement are focused primarily on our relationship to our ego. It's our ego that becomes traumatized, or our physical body, right? We also talked about the 4 different areas of growth: the physical area, the spiritual area, the psychological, and the emotional arenas. And let's just pretend that the physical body is also associated with ego, which is that's what our ego is trying to keep alive, is our physical body. Healing work is addressing wounds, traumas. We're sick in some form, or we're hurt in some way. And that needs to be addressed, and we need to get brought up to a baseline of health. Achievement is taking where we're at to the next level. It's getting out of our comfort zone. It's stretching. It's becoming more sophisticated iterations of ourselves as we reach our goals, as we accomplish projects, whatever that might mean. And we gain a lot of self-confidence and self-worth, a lot of self-esteem through achievement. But these are all still in the arena of ego. Transcendence requires us to get out of ego. It requires us to tap into something that is bigger than how we have previously defined ourselves, whether it's physical, spiritual, psychological, or emotional. It's understanding our identity on a whole different level. In fact, I would call it, in Jungian terms, it's tapping into the true self, the wholeness, the spaces and parts that live outside of our smaller definitions of who we believe we are. Now, this can look all different sorts of ways. When we discover more and more of ourselves and realize that earlier iterations were maybe elements that had been outsourced to other people, or they were limiting. They were things that we believed because we were not willing to look at. And I think a key component that should be addressed in this particular podcast is the concept around the shadow. It's times when our ego is not willing to look at shadow. And so we ended up trapping who we are in a relatively small area of our actual self, like our essence. Transcendence work is addressing the shadow. It's addressing a bigger component of who we are. It's being willing to take in the entire territory so that we let go of these limiting identifiers. We let go of these earlier iterations of who we think we are, and we're able to get to our true selves. So I know that's a mouthful, and I know that that's a really abstract concept, but I think we could pare it down again into these 4 different arenas of our lives and talk a little bit about what this looks like. Now, in the last podcast in achievement, we barely touched on the spiritual component because spiritual achievement is harder to recognize. You can do achievement work in spirituality, but oftentimes spirituality takes a bit of a backseat in achievement. With ego and transcendence work, spirituality takes a forefront. This is when we really tap into the spiritual part of who we are, and it's a lot tougher to really get to. It's much easier for us to believe we're doing transcendence work when we're not.
My energy coach, Glenn, told me when I was doing some work with him a couple years ago, this idea of primal man. He's like, I take a cold shower every morning, Joel. I said, why? He's like, because I want to get leverage on my primal man inside. That physicality, the appetites I have, the physical needs and comforts I seek. I want to, basically, I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said, I want to tell my physical body that it's not in charge of me. I'm transcended over its physicality. Now, clearly he has to eat and drink and live his life in a healthy way. You can't just not eat food. Well, I've transcended my physicality. I'm no longer going to eat. I don't think that's what he means. But he does mean not allowing your body to be the only thing in control of your life. I think that's a physical example of transcendence in that arena.
Yeah, when your impulses and appetites dictate what you're going to be doing, and especially if you've convinced yourself that those appetites and impulses are who you are, it's your identity. I'm the kind of person who, and then fills in the blank, or fill in the blank. It's when your identity is around what your body wants you to do. And this is, last week we talked about achievement. Let's pretend we're talking about somebody who is a health and wellness coach or has really focused on sculpting their body. Transcendence work would be no longer identifying yourself or creating an identity around being somebody in the health and wellness industry, around somebody who hits the gym every day, or around somebody who keeps their body a certain way. That doesn't mean you don't still do that stuff. It just means you've transcended the impulses around it. And maybe a good way of illustrating it is this idea of the difference between I am and I aming. So Alfred Krozipsky, who talks about general semantics, and we've done podcasts a long time ago on the concept of general semantics. It's this changing a nominalization, which is nominalizing is going from a verb to a noun. So I am is a nominalization because I'm not one thing. I'm not anything. I aming. I'm a verb. Like my identity, everything about me is a verb. It's something in action that changes all the time. But when I talk about myself, I say, well, I am blah, 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 blah. And I've nominalized myself. When we calcify our identities, when we say I am this thing, we are in oftentimes a healing or an achievement time period. We're not in a transcendence time period. So to go back to the person who is in health and wellness and and I've seen a lot of people in the health and wellness industry, they end up creating a career out of it because they started out sick. They started out in a sick place. And so they had to pour all this time and resource and identity into healing themselves. And then because they got into this trajectory of healing, once they were healed, they kept going down that trajectory and ended up in achievement. And then they optimized their body and they become a better version of themselves. And now they're sculpted and now they're, now they're teaching other people how to achieve the same thing. Transcendence is letting go of the identity created around being a health and wellness person. It's realizing that you are not this story. You're not this narrative. You're not this person who went through healing and then achieved. You kind of let go of all of that and realize that this is just the thing that's happening on your timeline. It might be an aspect of your identity. It never stops being your narrative or story. That is where you came from. That was the starting point in the etymology. But at this time period, your identity is no longer trapped in the ego part of this story of who you think you are and are identified by all of this, almost like window dressing. All of that becomes window dressing for something that's much, much bigger.
Man, you make such a good point because I think people, when they're truly in a transcendence place or they're working on transcendence, this can be very destabilizing for the rest of your life. Because I'm reading this book right now, Atomic Habits. I'm sure maybe you listening have heard of this book. It's a fantastic book. If you've never read it, it's a great resource. He talks a lot about, in Atomic Habits, the author, about creating an identity around the habits you want to have. Like the opposite of what you're talking about, Antonia. Like over-attaching to your ego about this. Like, I'm the kind of person that gets up early. I'm the kind of person that gets good sleep. I'm the kind of person that works out. I'm the kind of person that eats healthy. I'm the kind of person that is friendly and kind to people, or whatever the habits and things you want in your life to be the case. He talks about making them your identity to make them inevitable or to make them more likely to happen. And what I'm realizing as we're talking about this is when you go into a transcendent place and you start to give up some of those identities, well, you may not be able to achieve as much. You may not be able to have all the things like that. Those habits you've built might start to be harder to grasp onto. You might fall apart a little bit. And that's an interesting thing that I don't think anybody talks about. It's almost like in the messaging of personal growth, it's like when you start to get to transcendence level, everything gets better. You get zen. The life is so much better. You're in a better position to handle stuff that comes to you. You don't get triggered as much. Like, it's amazing when you get to transcendence. I don't know if that's actually accurate or true. I almost wonder if we're doing a really bad disservice to people to have that message out there. Because I guess it's not achievement. It's not trying to better something. It's trying to alter the way you see reality in general, like shift your reality frame. And I guess in some ways you're trying to spiral up or upgrade that, expand that. It's more expansive than it is achievement, I think. Mm-hmm. And expanded territory doesn't always bring good news.
Yeah.
It doesn't always bring positive things. Like, expanded territory usually brings a lot more challenge because now you got more stuff to deal with.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Oh, yeah. No, transcendence is not a beautiful place. Transcendence, like you said, I mean, I think that's a perfect way of saying it, is it's an area of expanded territory. You can no longer identify with things like habits, which, by the way, those are really helpful in an achievement time period. Over-identifying, calcifying those parts of who you are. Maybe not calcifying. Because
nominalizing.
But nominalizing. I am the kind of person who does this. That's really helpful for achievement. Same thing with healing, by the way. A lot of times navigating through the healing experience requires a strong association with the ego, because you have to remind yourself that you're worth the effort of getting to the other side of this pain. Like, you have to consider your ego as precious. It's an important thing that needs to show up in the universe. The universe cares about it. The messages that we give ourselves in a healing and an achievement time period are the exact opposite messages that we experience during a transcendence time period. So that's why usually it goes in order. It usually starts with healing, goes to achievement, and ends in transcendence. But by the time you get a little taste of all three of these elements, and this, of course, is it through the lens of personal growth and development. It's not just healing because you have to, or achieving because you feel inspired to do so. We're talking about specifically doing growth and development. So the tools you're tapped into, the ways of handling these arenas of your life in the healthiest possible way that don't compound the problems, right? That actually get you through healing without screwing something else up, actually getting to achievement without being a dick at the end of it. You know what I mean? Like doing it the right way oftentimes ends up sort of naturally encouraging people to go to transcendence.
Well, it's like you heal, you get yourself to a platform of ability, you achieve, you explore all the achievement territory that you can see right now, and then you hit transcendence, you're like, okay, well, I'm going to expand the territory to see more. Mm-hmm. So they do go in a sequence, I guess, but I would argue they're not just linear. I'd add to what you said, Antonia. They're not just linear, they're cyclical. Mm-hmm. The cycle then repeats itself. Like, now the expanded territory is going to bring more healing and achievement work to do. You're going to go ahead, get the platform back to where you can start, you can achieve again, and now you're going to hit the limit of all the explored territory and want to transcend again.
Right. And that expanded territory is not a walk in the park. It's, well, like I said, the messages that are critical for healing and achievement end up being almost like counterintuitively wrong for transcendence. And that is, in healing and achievement, like I mentioned, your ego is important. It's important to see it as valuable. It's important to see it as worthy of attention, worthy of healing, worthy of getting to the next level, self-confidence, self-esteem, self-worth, self-value. I call them the selves. All of that is really important for those two elements. Transcendence ends up telling you to look at the bad news. So when our shadow shows up and we're in healing and achievement, most resources and tools, and not inappropriately, by the way, most resources and tools tell you to rationalize the shadow. It tells you to depersonalize from the shadow. Particularly in healing work, I mean, if you go through emotional and psychological healing, a lot of it is thinking things like, this isn't my fault. I'm on the receiving end of this. Because if you add on to your healing work, whatever it is, all of this self-blame, all of this, I'm a bad person, right? And I'm a terrible person. Just like we mentioned in that first podcast, if you have an infection and you hit your hand against a door jamb when you have maybe a hangnail that has an infection, that is an intolerable experience versus just hitting your hand against a door jamb normally, right? You can handle that. It's not that big of a deal. When you're in healing, you can't see your shadow in those moments. It's way too much. It's like it overwhelms and it's demoralizing, and it's just not the time period to be exploring the bad news parts of who you are. When you're in an achievement time period, it's a waste of time. You're trying to get to something that's taking all of this real estate to get to the next level. So when you see bad news about yourself, you handle it, quote unquote. Like that's an achievement, you just handle that. I'm going to have a better habit. I'm going to have more self-discipline. I'm going to do things that turn my attention away from the shadow part of who I am and focus on my end game, what my goal is, and gain self-confidence through my ego while I'm doing it. By the time you get to transcendence work, though, you're now ready. And oftentimes people get to transcendence when they've achieved enough to be able to subsidize this work, meaning that they have their life set up well enough so that if they enter this terrain, it's not going to screw everything else up. If a person enters a time period of transcendence, they're now ready to look at this larger territory and observe the shadow. And the shadow is bad news. It's the part of us that we can't rationalize away. It's the part of us that is at times evilly undermining. It is the part of us that is bad news, right? This is not like we're not all wonderful. We're not all 100% great. There are elements and aspects of us that are dirty fighters. And it probably emerged, through maybe evolutionary terms, it emerged as part of our survival strategy. We had to have elements inside of us that allow us to fight dirty. Even the people who are well into their ego that see themselves as kind, generous, wouldn't hurt a fly kind of people have this part of who they are inside of them. Everybody does. It's the human experience.
Except for Mr. Rogers, right?
Even Mr. Rogers,
What?
Joel.
Even Mr. Rogers?
I know. It's hard for me to even conceptualize it.
You've destroyed my childhood.
I know. I don't like to think about it either, Joel. But transcendence work means taking in this larger territory and looking directly at the shadow. And that is not fun. That is just about as painful as some of the most painful healing work.
I can see attempts at a transcendence frame for personal growth that have emerged in the world. As an example, the faith background I grew up in, a very evangelical Christian faith background, has this notion of accepting that idea of shadow in me. Like, oh, I'm sinful in front of God. I've got bad news. Like it's an attempt to accept that part and like look at it and say, okay, yeah, that's there. And then have a external God figure cover that with a propitiatory sacrifice in my faith background to cover that shadow that I have. And that's going to make me okay now. My ego can have satisfaction and good feelings that God has taken care of that shadow part of me. It's still there. I'm awful, wicked, sinful, but somehow that's now taken care of and taken off the table. So I think that we've had attempts of this. We can see aspects of it or have access points for it to get glimpses of what this might look like already in our society. And I think the work we're talking about with transcendence work is bringing that now more in-house, not having that necessarily be part of a religion or external framework, but that transcendence piece, again, that subjective nature of you as the person. We talked about this in healing. We talked about this in achievement. We'll talk about this in transcendence. It's very personal, subjective to you. Religion tried to codify it and make it externalized or at least collective, but it really is you and your transcendence journey, the territory you want or need to expand for yourself.
Yeah. Oh, I would actually argue that that's still an ego play. I mean, I do believe that spirituality throughout history.
What is an ego play?
The concept of like maybe original sin.
Yeah.
And how we
Well, it's to make the ego
that.
feel better. Yeah.
Well, I mean, to get more specific on that, I do believe that religion and spirituality have attempted to make room and space for the shadow parts of who we are because we can't deny them since we see the effects of them all the time. The effects of them being that we are badly behaved. And it's hard to own it. When we're in an ego time period, when we're badly behaved, we either rationalize the behavior and explain it away why we had to do it, or we deny that it was part of who we are by saying things like, well, that wasn't me.
Yeah.
I don't know who that was, but that wasn't me. That's the ego running cover for shadow behavior. But we still behave in a shadow way. It comes up all the time. We see bad behaviors constantly. And I think spirituality and particularly certain religions have attempted to make space for it because they can't deny the emergent behaviors. But as an ego salve, they have things like a propitiatory sacrifice. The word propitiation comes, if I remember correctly, from the Ark of the Covenant back in Jerusalem. In the in Judeo-Christian theory, back when the Israelites had the temple, the Ark of the Covenant was supposed to represent, sort of
God's spirit.
And there was a literal covering. It was like a blanket or a small carpet or a rug or whatever. And it was called the propitiatory cover. And propitiation, it was a representation of what, the sacrifice, the messianic sacrifice was supposed to do for original sin. It was supposed to cover it all over. So this idea of a propitiation or a covering meant that this is in you, but you don't have to worry about it. Somebody else has it handled. Somebody else has it taken care of. There's a provision for you to not have to integrate it, to even look at it anymore. You just deny its influence on you and continue to look forward to that time period where you won't have it anymore. And that's an ego salve. The ego is like, oh, well, I'm just like everybody else, right? I'm not going to own my particular shadow. I'm just going to say,
I'm a sinner saved by grace.
That's right. Exactly. And there's this notion that the shadow is something that we have to acknowledge but not own, right? And it's almost like an infection. Like the shadow parts of us are something we're infected with, and this is any culture that has a Judeo-Christian influence to it. We have an infection of sin, but we depersonalize it. It's a condition as opposed to part of who we are. And because it's a condition, it needs medicine. And that medicine will come through spirituality. So I'm realizing now that we probably should talk a little bit about what we mean when we say ego and shadow.
Yeah, because something comes up for me. I'm thinking a lot about like Buddhism, for example. Would we argue that Buddhism is closer to a transcendence frame? Or is it just the same as the Judeo-Christian framework? It's just a different color of the day, because the idea is that we transcend our desires to something bigger. So we're expanding our territory. But I'll see Buddhists that are acting up, like they're some countries that are hostile to other religions, just like any religion is. So the essence or the intention of all these religions and practices, I think, is to really struggle with some of these concepts, expansion of our shadow and looking at it and trying to own it, I think. But maybe it stops short and it still gets into the ego in some ways.
Well, I think Buddhism, just like Judeo-Christianity, is an attempt to acknowledge and recognize these elements. But yeah, individual people still behave badly. I mean, right now, I would have never thought I would see Buddhists attempting genocide on Muslims on the planet, but that's what's happening right now in Uyghur, right? It's like, it's not good. So even if the original thoughts were an attempt to transcend, the result is not necessarily fundamentally working on everybody who adopts these theories. That said, there is let me talk a little bit about what I mean by ego and shadow, and then we'll get back into this idea of transcendence. So I'm going to use Jung's archetypes, or 4 archetypes of identity, to explain it, because I think it's like the easiest way to tap into what all of this is. So Jung had 4 archetypes, and these are found in his work, in his books, his collected works, Psychological Types as well, that book. But the 4 archetypes are persona, ego, shadow, and self. And we've talked about this in previous podcasts. In fact, I think it even is called something around Jungian archetypes. And these 4 aspects are 4 elements of ourselves that we build relationships with to some extent. Persona is the mask that we show up with to the world. And people tend to demonize persona while at the same time not recognizing that they're fully in it. None of these components should be demonized. These are all just basically the building blocks of identity for every human being. Persona is the slice of who we are that we're going to allow as our interface to the outside world. So when a person has a persona that other people don't like, it's usually a very manufactured mask. It's not a true representation of who they are, or it's a very, very, very small slice of what they're allowing other people to see. So personas are rarely fake. They're usually just curated. And when a person has a persona other people think is inauthentic, it's not inauthentic. It's just very, very incomplete. It's just a really tiny little slice. And that's usually what we think of when we think of persona. But anytime somebody's interfacing with anyone, they're interfacing with the persona, the part of themselves that they're allowing another person to interact with, the slice of themselves that they're willing to show the other individual. The people that we think have no persona are usually the ones who are very flexible with their persona. They're very transparent. When an individual is talking to them and seeking any form of intimacy, that individual is flexible enough to be able to show them, like, it's almost like they're shifting it in real time. What is it that you are looking for from me? And am I willing to show that to you? Sure. And we think of those as very authentic people because they don't have as tightly managed, curated interface. They seem to have a more flexible, open, transparent interface. But that's still a persona. It's still the component that they're willing to show you, because even people who are open and transparent have components of themselves that they will not show the outside world, and no sure they feel obligated to, right? We all have a component of ourselves that we should be keeping for ourselves, in my opinion, or for people that we're very, very intimate with, like partners. So that's persona. Behind persona lives ego, and ego is how we generally define ourselves. It's the part of us that believes on some level that we're the center of the universe. I always say it's the part of us that believes that when we die, it'll be the greatest tragedy the universe has ever experienced. And so that is an element, or that element of us is what we usually think of when we think of identity. It's all the things that we're willing to see about ourselves. And when we get attacked, it's the ego that comes to our defense, generally. It's usually the ego that says, I'm not allowed to be treated that way. Or if a person has a very insecure ego, they will allow themselves to be treated that way, right? It's the part of us that struggles with boundaries.
I'm not allowed to say I'm not allowed to be treated that way.
Right, exactly. Right. But it's very I am. Like we said before, it is the nominalization part of who we are. Now, sometimes people get ego and persona kind of mixed up. One of the easiest phenomena to understand this is things like role-person merger, where I am my career or I am my station in life. If a person says, I am a mom, and that's their identity, that's them merging their interface with the outside world, or what they think the outside world needs to know about them, with what their ego thinks is a major part of their identity, or I am a doctor, or I am a stockbroker, or I am a whatever. But the I aming, or the I am part, oftentimes comes from the ego. The shadow is almost like a photo negative of the ego. It's all the bad parts of who we are. By bad, I mean bad subjectively, bad to ourselves. It's the part of us that offends our own convictions oftentimes. Whatever convictions and values have been developed in the ego, they are the part of us that offend those values. So if I see myself as transparent and honest, my shadow is undermining and manipulative and will let people think wrong things, right? It's not upfront. If I see myself as a defender of the weak, it's the part of me that's willing to exploit the weak. If I see myself as somebody who would never fill in the blank, it's the part of me that will do fill in the blank, basically.
We will be right back. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker. Now back to the show. Those are hard things to see about the self. They're really tough to look at directly and accept that we have those things inside of ourselves. Like those are really tough.
Well, because we have autoresponder sequences written into our brain that immediately irrationalize them. Like all the healing and achievement, even people in personal growth and development, all the healing and achievement work we've done has taught us not to do this, has taught us to rationalize it away in order to be in a space where we can do healing or do achievement. This is a place that requires a certain amount of resource. We have to be resourced. It's like, I used the word earlier, subsidized, but we do. We have to be on some level subsidized to be able to handle looking directly at the shadow because of what it does to us. It's so hard to look directly in the mouth of the devil and realize that that's me. I'm looking in the mouth of me. I'm the devil.
I've actually known people who maybe had really massive success in their life and then entered this time period and they weren't subsidized to the level they probably needed to be, and they lost a lot. Like this is it's a tough place to be because their business fell apart, or the achievement they had slipped from their grasp, or some of the healing work they had done, it opened old wounds. Like it's really a hard place, I think, for many people when they get here, unless you've got the things set up to enable and subsidize and support this spot. You can run into some challenges.
Well, it's also hard to know whether or not you're truly here because it kind of sounds like being insecure. I think the reason why you have to be subsidized is you have to be at a place where you can tell the difference between looking in the shadow and accepting it versus owning imperfections or being insecure and telling yourself you're a bad person. Like, a lot of times when people think they're in this space where they're accepting the shadow, they're actually just in healing work. They're in a place where they're like, oh, I'm bad and wrong, because they got some sort of mind virus that undermines their self-esteem and self-confidence or self-worth. And so if you have low self-esteem and self-worth and self-value, you're not in a place to be able to integrate the shadow. You're not in a place to be able to look at it directly. You have to be at a place where you have plenty of self-esteem, plenty of self-value, plenty of self-confidence. And then when you look at the shadow, you're now in a place where you can start integrating it and acknowledging it without it making you feel like you're just this terrible human being. Because shadow work isn't thinking you're the devil. It's seeing the devil inside and recognizing that it is actually a valid part of your human experience. It's just a part of who you are. It's the yin to the yang. It's the photo negative of the ego. It's just there. And it doesn't have to necessarily be judged, just like the ego doesn't have to be judged. So I think when we say things like, I know I'm not perfect, that's not us integrating the shadow. That's us seeing that the shadow has come out and realizing we have to own that. It's recognizing that all humans are imperfect, right? And it's still usually ego work. We're usually still in healing or achievement when we make those kinds of comments, or we're not in personal growth at all and we still make those kinds of comments. But shadow work is its own beast. Once a person has understood the importance of not being in an overly curated version of persona or mask, and they have done a little bit deeper dive into ego, once they have healed their ego and maybe achieved in a way where they have more self-confidence, self-value, self-worth to be able to look directly at the shadow, what ends up happening is the territory of the self gets massively expanded. And that's the fourth Jungian archetype, which is the self. And the self is usually drawn, even in Jung's work, as a circle that extends beyond persona, persona, ego, and shadow, meaning that the self is actually a bigger territory that lives even outside of those encapsulations. It is huge. And once you get to a place where you start tapping into self, you start to realize who you were meant to be, which is impossible to shrink down to ego. It's impossible to shrink down to shadow. Like, some people actually have chosen to be in shadow over ego. I think I mentioned this in the podcast before, but there's a moment in the show Breaking Bad where the character Jesse Pinkman, who Breaking Bad is all about, basically people who make meth and sell it.
Well, the entire show is about surrendering to your shadow also.
Yeah.
I mean, in a way.
Yeah. And Jesse Pinkman says at some point, he's one of the main characters, he says, I know who I am. I'm the bad guy. And that's him choosing to live in shadow versus live in ego, which always feels like a weird choice to everybody else who has chosen to live in ego rather than shadow. But he's making the same choice everybody else is making. He's just choosing the other side. There's more. He was denying ego. Most people deny shadow, but both need to be seen and integrated. When a person sees and integrates both aspects of themselves, and by integration, it just means acceptance, recognition, realizing that there are moments in which this is the appropriate tool for the job. And at the very least, just owning it, just embracing it, that it's part of who you are. Now, that doesn't mean encouraging it to behave poorly, just like we don't encourage our ego to behave poorly. We still want to have self-discipline. We still want to have a place of, or habits we've developed that have us showing up as the most authentic expression of ourselves, and handing ourselves over to any element of who we are is not wholeness of self, right? If we hand ourselves over to the bad behavior of the ego, the bad behavior of the persona, or the bad behavior of the shadow, that's not honoring self. That's not a transcendent thing to do. But when we get to a certain place, we see all of these aspects of who we are. And we recognize that there's a lot of territory that is generally unexplored because we were spending so much time trying to accomplish things in the outside world. Or we were spending so much time just trying to feel okay. Or we were spending time trying to rationalize away our behavior so that we could see ourselves as we wanted to. When a person gets into self and they get into a truly transcended place, a key ingredient is you have to let go of who that person ends up being. You can't decide first who you want to be and then end up forcing the self to be that person. You have to accept what the self is beyond expectations. And oftentimes our inner wisdom is smart enough to give us hints along the way of who that person will be. So these little crumbs of, I want to see myself as this kind of person, is oftentimes not too far off from what the self is. We oftentimes have ambitions to hit markers, mile markers, to get closer and closer to self. So our values in our ego usually are not that far from the values of the self. They're just limitations. They're less sophisticated versions of how the self is going to experience them. And transcendence work is getting into self.
I think somebody could be listening to this right now and saying, well, then what the heck is the point? And Joel, you talk about how it's hard and it's going to disrupt things and it's going to expand the territory. Now you got to heal and achieve more. And Antonia, you're talking about looking directly at the shadow and integrating the bad parts of myself, or not integrating, but owning them and claiming them. Like, it doesn't really sound like there's an upside to this, right?
Yeah, well, just like we mentioned in the healing podcast, sometimes people have to spend their whole lives in healing. They just do. Because of their preconditions, or maybe something terrible happened to them. I mentioned, a child that got polio many years ago and ended up in an iron lung. Like, circumstances beyond your control might make it so that you're in healing, or, maybe something you chose ends up making it so that you have to remain in healing for the rest of your life. And I've noticed that a lot of times people make that choice with achievement. They just make the choice with achievement. They don't want to go further than that. They want to spend the rest of their life in achievement. And that's, honestly, this is just a model. It's not a prescription for how you have to live your life. You don't ever have to go to transcendence.
Great point. I mean, it's a great point. Yeah, this is a map.
Yeah, these are options, right? This is in the game of life. You can min-max it however you want to, and these are one of the options. Is that you can, you can choose to do transcendence work if you want to, and not everybody has the option to do this. I mean, I think actually we end up talking about this almost every time we mention this element of transcendence work. Is it's like, why would anybody ever do this? And I think in the same way that some people are just driven to achieve. I think about the Rupert Murdochs of the world, who it's like you already achieved everything you wanted to achieve. Why are you still in this game until the minute you die? Like, what's going on for you?
Oh, yeah.
And I always relate it back to, the DSM, I think it was version 4 or something, which the DSM is basically a dictionary of mental health issues. At some point wrote in a mental health issue, or it wasn't maybe mental health issue, but it's like a phenomena where people can't stop writing, like the Stephen Kings of the world or the Nora Roberts. They have hundreds of books. And it very well may be that they have a condition that makes it so that they can't stop writing. And so when somebody is driven to do something and they can't stop, I always think they have whatever for their line of work or their industry, whatever that thing is for those writers. They can't stop themselves. It's a compulsion at this point. And so some people are just compelled to achieve for the rest of their lives. And, there's a lot of rewards that come with that. So why not? I think that some people are compelled to transcend. It's not something they choose.
It's native to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like a compulsion. I wouldn't be surprised if I saw it at the DSM at some point. It's like I just have to. And those people who are compelled to do so end up being models for what it looks like for the rest of us. Because I don't think I'm a person who is intrinsically or instinctively compelled to transcend, or at least I wasn't in an earlier time period of my life. But when I got to a certain point, it seemed like the next logical thing to do. And I had models of what it looks like. I had people who had transcended, and I saw what they, their journey. And I was like, I think I want a little bit of that. And what I've observed is just like when people go through the hard work of healing, they get to the other side and they feel so much better. They're like, why didn't I do this before? Right? Or I'm finally through my physical therapy, or I'm finally through whatever. The antibiotic finally worked. There is a relief that comes at the end of healing work that's hard to even understand how good it's going to feel on the other side. But oftentimes the pain of the moment is enough to compel people to do the hard work of healing. For achievement, it's hard to explain the feeling on the other side. It's like exhilaration. It's this feeling of awe of the self. And it feels so good to get on the other side of achievement, usually. If a person, again, is doing it with a growth frame, you can achieve and still beat yourself up. But if a person's doing it for growth and development, the other side of that achievement feels so good. It's hard to communicate. It's oftentimes why people succeed and then go into teaching how to do it, because they want other people to experience it as well. Transcendence is a hard work. It requires you to let go of everything you knew about yourself in all of these different arenas. We haven't really woven this in as much, but we've been talking in this series about the physical, the spiritual, the psychological, and the emotional. And the thing that has to be done in transcendence is letting go of all the groundwork you've laid in all of those four categories as identities. You can't identify yourself in any of those arenas anymore, because they're probably incomplete identities. When you transcend and get into self, everything feels incomplete all of a sudden. All the groundwork you laid before, it's almost like you had to work super duper hard to realize that wasn't the real thing to begin with. And so it's hard to express and communicate on the other side the sense of peace that comes with it. There's a sense of, this is who I was meant to be, is in this place of self. A person gets to tap into essence. They become the thing that their ego's been resisting the entire time, or their shadow has been resisting the entire time. And now, I wouldn't say that there's a feeling of indestructibleness, but there's this sense that it's really hard to ruffle the feathers of somebody who's done transcendence work, right? What's the phrase? Unfuckwithable. It's like you kind of become a person who can't be messed with anymore. And not that you can't be messed with, but it's really hard to get triggered. It's really hard to get upset. It's really hard to get, to beat yourself up. You just kind of, it's this place of almost radical self-acceptance of all of the territory. And because there's that expanded territory, there's the joy of self-discovery. You get to discover more and more about your true self as you go. And so I think the reward on the other side is that. And if a person wants that, right? If they want to have that experience, just like they want relief or exhilaration, if they want that peace, then they'll go through the hard work of doing it.
I would posit that it's also quiet. Usually you're not going to see somebody going through this. They kind of disappear to do it often. It's a personal, quiet experience. So if you are at this place in your life and you think this is where you're going to be, it's probably a lonely journey. It's on your own a lot, that you're really going through dark nights of the soul, dark nights of the senses. You're trying to get a sense of something beyond. And I think the quietness is part of it because you get rid of all the noise. I mean, how many spiritual teachers and leaders, when they talk about transcendence, go up to the mountaintop, metaphorically and literally, to get away from it all, to get closer to spirituality or God or some higher state of something. And I think that's really what it is, or wandering in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. These metaphors
Right.
or stories we have from spiritual people or spiritual journeys, quests that people go on. It's very quiet, individual, on your own. And often it's that encounter with self. I think a lot of that scene in Empire Strikes Back with Luke Skywalker training with Yoda, and he goes in the forest and he's having this battle with his father, Darth Vader. And he's struggling with this external force of his father, and he's with his lightsaber fighting, and he chops Darth Vader's head off. And he goes over and he removes the helmet, and he sees his own face in his father. And he's realizing, oh, I've been struggling with myself. Like I'm having a transcendent encounter with self here. There's something going on here that I'm at war with myself. I'm learning something about my own ego, about my essence, about my shadow. Oh, there's part of Darth Vader in me. What a shadow that's in me. I see that. And I think that's an experience that Luke Skywalker has in that movie. It's a good example of some of this transcendence type work. And he had to do that quietly. He wasn't around Yoda when he's doing it. He's out in the woods, the forest of the planet he's on, having that encounter with self, seemingly fighting an external enemy, but really it's himself he's struggling with.
Yeah, well, and I think all that individuation work that we were talking about in achievement, which is good, healthy work, by the way. I think when a person gets to transcendence, there's that concept of unity mind where you start to recognize that you are everyone and everyone is you. I think that starts to show up too. So there is Darth Vader in him because he's Darth Vader and Darth Vader is him. On some level, that becomes esoterically clear, if that makes sense.
Well, and that's the part of the Jungian framework we didn't mention, which is the collective unconscious.
Right.
This idea of being tethered to a cloud of consciousness that is beyond our perceptions in a way, or measurements.
Yeah, exactly. And so transcendence work, I mean, like healing work almost always happens with a community feel. That's why we're very community oriented right now. I mentioned in that podcast, or we mentioned in that podcast, that we think that society is in a time period of healing. Well, healing is all about supporting each other. So we're in a very collectivist time period right now. When society is going through an achievement time period, we become very individuated. We're in an individualistic time period. When we get to transcendence, it's a little of column B and a little of column A and a little column B. You're a little of both. You're both an individual and a collectivist. Because there's a sense of unity, but then there's a sense of this is my personal expression of the collective. And so both are appropriate. And you can play with both. You can play with times when a person needs to be more collectivist, and you can play with a time period where a person needs to be more individualistic. And they're both equally appropriate. They're both equally good tools for a job. You just get to grab which one is the better one. And you don't have a bias towards either, actually. I tend, because I've always been an achievement person, I tend to generally, when I'm in persona, when I'm showing people the parts of myself that I want them to see, I trend to have a bias towards individualism. And I think that's probably because of how I'm wired. I use introverted thinking. TPs tend to be individualistic. And so...
Your generation?
I'm a Gen Xer, right, exactly. I've been very propagandized into individualism. And I don't mind that part of who I am. But when I tap into wholeness of self, I realize I'm just as equally of a collectivist as I am an individualist. I just think right now we have a bias societally towards collectivism, and so I need to represent individualism. But if we had a bias towards individualism, I'd probably be talking about collectivism, honestly.
Well, if you listen to the podcast, maybe even back at the beginning of our podcast, we probably did have language more like that.
I think we did, actually. I think we very much talked about collectivism because I think we were still coming out of an individualistic time period.
Yeah.
And so, it's like one of those things where you can kind of play back and forth. And there are a lot of advantages to it. There's definitely tons of advantages, but it's not for everyone, and I don't think everybody has to. But the point of all three of these podcasts was to help people diagnose what element and area of personal growth that they're in, and to not mistake them for each other. In that original HAT model podcast, we mentioned a couple principles to look out for. First, we have a tendency to get attracted to one of these three elements and stay there. And we don't give due to the other elements or the other areas. So if you notice that you have a bias for any of these, then stretch to the other one.
Because if we're attracted to that one, we're going to think that's the tool for all the jobs. The reason you stretch to the others is because you can't use transcendence to heal or achieve. You can't achieve your way into transcendence or healing. You can't heal your way to building a business. Like, you have to do the work in that zone, is what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. So make sure that you are building skill in all of them. This keeps people from being on the hamster wheel of healing all the time, or on the hamster wheel of achievement, or less so the hamster wheel of transcendence work. It reminds you to keep your finger on the pulse of all of it and ensure that you're, like you said, achievement and transcendence can actually cause trauma. You can do yourself a grave disservice if you need healing work, but you're doing achievement or transcendence work. So make sure that your bias isn't keeping you from doing the work you need to be doing. Or a person might be constantly and perpetually in healing and have nothing to show for it. They have no achievements in the outside world, right? They're always in the middle of a money crisis. They're always in the middle of some sort of challenge with their relationships or whatever. And so make sure that you are accurately diagnosing which element you need, and have the flexibility to go in and out of them. Right? Like, sometimes we have healing work to do in one arena, but we have achievement work to do in another arena. And if the healing work isn't intense, it's not too intense, you can actually kind of do both of them at the same time sometimes. But also be sensitive to when one element needs your full attention, because that happens too. So only you know you, so you're going to have to self-assess in all of this. But just make sure that you don't, that if you have a bias, you're aware of that and you're not using the wrong tools for the job. And then also what you just mentioned, Joel, is try not to mistake them for each other. There's a bunch of people who think transcendence work is healing work, and vice versa. There's a bunch of people who think healing work is achievement, and vice versa. Or achievement and transcendence work are the same. Don't mistake them for each other. Have clear definitions around them and understand how they show up in your life in these 4 categories. Again, physical, spiritual, psychological, and emotional. And just get really, really good at noticing which tools and which programs or which, thought leaders or whatever are the ones that you're currently attracted to. And when you're attracted to certain content, oftentimes that will help you tap into what work needs to be attended and addressed at this time.
So what do you think? You've been here with us, hopefully for all 3 podcasts, this little series. Well, hopefully for all the podcasts we release. But in this particular series, you've heard the Healing, Achievement, Transcendence podcast. You've been here with us in this episode. What is coming up for you? What is your what is your transcendent journey look like? You can also talk about your achievement and healing as well, if you haven't had a chance to voice yourself in the last 2 episodes. But this one, we want to hear about transcendence. What was your experience, or what is your experience? Come over to personalityhacker.com. Directly below this episode, you can leave a comment, ask a question, or more importantly, share your personal story. What is the story of your transcendence journey? Maybe you're early in on it. Maybe you haven't really had a transcendent moment yet. Maybe it's something you fear. Maybe it's something you've been through and you feel like you have expanded territory. We want to hear about that. So come over, make your voice heard at personalityhacker.com.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave a rating review for us on iTunes, it helps us out a lot, and I enjoy reading them, so please do. We have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it at all major book retailers, and you can also special order it through your local bookstore. If you read it and enjoy it, it dives deep into your personal cognitive functions for your personality type and gives you a bunch of growth tools that could relate to either healing, achievement, or transcendence. Pick yourself up a copy, and if you enjoy it, you can also leave a rating on Amazon or on Goodreads. That helps us out a lot as well. And if you are ready to take your personal growth to the next level, we have a suite of programs that are growth-oriented through the lens of personality type. So head over to personalityhacker.com and under our suite of programs, see which one is right for you.
Thank you for being with us in this short series of conversation. We appreciate you being part of the show, and we hope to talk to you next week on the next episode. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, We are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker.